Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is the first of our three-part series put on by Junior League of New Orleans and the Abolish Movement. And the movement is centered around ending human trafficking. And I'll give you a quick update of Junior League and Abolish, a quick overview before I get to introduce our amazing speakers tonight. So Abolish Movement was founded in 2014 by the Junior League of Tampa. And it was to really bring attention to human trafficking. And so in 2017, AJLI, which is the National Organization for Junior Leagues, adopted this. And our own Junior League here in New Orleans started this as an initiative just last year. And many of you may be familiar if you attended any of our events. Susan was there with us, who I'll introduce in a second. But this is something that JLNO is committed to raising awareness, provide support, and putting an end to human trafficking. So we thank you again for joining us tonight, and we will start our series off. So without, with one thing, we need to make sure to recognize our sponsors tonight. So we couldn't have done this without our group, Women United. So just to give you a little bit about overview about them, it's a global organization, 70,000 plus women. They focus on policy, philanthropy, and programming. We have many of our Women United members, as well as our Junior League members and the community joining us tonight. So thank you to our Women United members for helping us put this on, this very important discussion in this series. If you want to learn more about Women United, they included their website there, or please feel free to reach out to that email you see there. But they are doing great work in our community, and thank you again to Women United. So I will now introduce our two wonderful speakers tonight. We have two incredible women joining us to talk to us about human trafficking. One thing that just before we start, I want to just housekeeping, we all know now Zoom by now, right? But just if you can, please mute your speakers, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of this. So please utilize your chat box, and we will make sure to address all of your questions tonight. So with that, I will introduce Leanne McCallum, who is our Strategic Project Manager, Strategic Projects Manager for the Alliance of Children's Advocacy Centers. That is her current role. She actually was just previously the task force coordinator of the Greater New Orleans Human Trafficking Task Force. As that coordinator, she facilitated multidisciplinary collaboration between law enforcement, social services, other sectors to enhance partnerships to combat human trafficking. Her work in New Orleans is incredible. She'll speak to it and give us lots of examples and insight there, but really has done an incredible job and takes a leadership position here in our cities, and we're lucky to have her here tonight with us. And then also we have Susan, again, who's might look familiar to some of our Junior League members. Thanks for joining us again. So Susan is the systems administrator for Truckers Against Trafficking. Last year, she was so generous, her and her team brought down the big truck that we got to tour. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we get to visit via Zoom, but we'll be back and bring it back for sure to the city. But Susan, in her role, she is bookkeeper, HR manager, helps to manage the Freedom Drivers Project, which is the one I just mentioned that came to us last year. She's been involved in anti-trafficking for over 10 years. She co-founded a local nonprofit in Denver. She helped start a recovery house and is passionate about educating people on the realities of domestic sex trafficking. So ladies, again, we really thank you on behalf of Junior League for joining us tonight. And I will turn this over to Susan to get us started.
Great, thanks so much, Michelle. So happy to be here. Like I said, I work for Truckers Against Trafficking. So just a quick little overview of TAT, as we call it. We are a national organization. Our mission is to educate, equip, empower, and mobilize members of the trucking, bus, and energy industries to combat human trafficking just as part of their everyday jobs. And so I love to empower people to fight trafficking, and I get to do that all the time. And so that's super exciting for me. And so let's turn it over to Leanne. Leanne, tell us just a little bit more. I know Michelle gave you a little bit of your background, but let's talk about your path into getting into human trafficking in your current role.
Yeah, absolutely. So currently I am the Strategic Projects Manager for the Louisiana Alliance of Children's Advocacy Center. In 2018, Louisiana Alliance of Children's Advocacy Center, in partner with the Governor's Office of Louisiana, was awarded a 3-year grant to create anti-trafficking collaboratives to respond to child trafficking across the state of Louisiana. So I'm lucky enough to manage that project right now through LACAC. And previously, I was the task force coordinator for the Greater New Orleans Human Trafficking Task Force. So I am really lucky to be able to do anti-trafficking work here in our Greater New Orleans community, now statewide in Louisiana. But my journey started a little bit farther away. I actually got into doing anti-trafficking work in 2010 with a research trip to Southeast Asia. I was really interested in human rights, and I went to Southeast Asia and I learned about the ways that human trafficking can happen in cross-border migration in, for example, the Thai-Burma border refugee crisis. So I was so interested in that. I just felt an immediate connection to that work. So I've been doing human trafficking research and committing my studies to that ever since. So my journey has taken me from Seattle to Denver and Southeast Asia, and now landed here in beautiful Louisiana to do this work long term.
Great. So, so many people think that human trafficking is happening over there, right? You mentioned going over to Asia. And it is happening over there everywhere, but it is for sure happening here. So, I love that connection there. And I, of course, was one of those people that thought trafficking is happening somewhere else until I realized, oh my word, it is happening here in our own country. And it's very, very prevalent. Another thing you kind of brought up was, that cross-border. So we're going to define human trafficking for you.
Right.
I'm going to define human trafficking, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But let's not confuse smuggling with trafficking, because a lot of people do that. And we can agree, I'm sure, that it is intermixed. Those who are smuggled can be trafficked, and those who are trafficked can be smuggled, but they are two different issues, right? Smuggling is a crime against the border. Smuggling is a crime against a border. Trafficking is a crime against a person. Yes. So with that, let's define human trafficking, right? It's the exploitation of human beings through force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of either commercial sex or forced labor, where a third party is making a profit. So as we pick that apart a little bit, right, we've got that force, fraud, and coercion, right? So people can be forced, anything from, one-off beatings to branded to beatings to knifing to, you name it, right? They can be frauded, right? So promise of something like you can, you always hear about this, modeling careers, or even something as simple as a change to a new restaurant, right? Or go to a new state to take care of somebody's kids. But then that doesn't happen, right? They're forced into sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And then that coercion piece is probably the one we see the most, where people are coerced. So their families are threatened, they're threatened, and they just cannot escape, right? There are no actual physical chains on these people, and because they don't need them. The traffickers do not need those types of physical restraints because they have the mental and emotional bonds and restraints, so to speak, for the people that they are trafficking. And, when you think about sex trafficking, that can take any number of forms, right? Brothels, street prostitution, massage parlors, right? That's been in the news in the last couple of years, strip clubs even. And when we think of labor trafficking, that can be anything from, like agricultural work we think of. It could be construction, it could be restaurant, it could be someone in your house, or, like a maid. So those are two types of trafficking. And of course, we call the trafficker, that third party person, a trafficker or an abuser. So I realized, whoa, that was a lot of information I just threw at everybody. But maybe, Leanne, you could sort of talk a little bit more about any of those topics that you think that I missed anything, or just elaborate on.
Yeah, no, that was a great description of what the definition of trafficking is. And I think it's really important that we talk through the definition. It's not the most fun part of the discussion, but so often what we think trafficking is the images that we've seen. We think of the physical force. We think of those physical restraints. We think of images with mouths covered. We think of very specific things because that's what we've seen in TV shows and in the media. In reality, the experiences of our clients are usually quite different than what's depicted in the media. So for example, as Susan alluded to, there was a study done by Polaris, which is the National Human Trafficking Hotline, is run by Polaris. They're just an incredible resource center. They did a study about the experiences of trafficking survivors. And what they found is that actually coercion, not physical force, was the most common experience of survivors. About 70% of survivors who responded had experienced that psychological coercion, that mental control. It's not the locked cage or the locked doors every time that we see in the media. And so, these are just some examples of the ways that traffickers use relationships and they use threats to keep folks in bondage, even though there aren't physical bonds. And I think that that's a really important distinction. In Louisiana, there are some specific industries where trafficking can happen. It's quite vulnerable. Is that a good place to move to for this conversation?
Yeah, totally fine.
Great. Okay, so in terms of sex trafficking, I remember where I was going with that. In Louisiana, we have some really unique legislation that is particularly tough on traffickers and is unique to our state. So in the state of Louisiana for youth, first of all, there doesn't have to be a third party for it to be considered trafficking. If a person under the age of 18 exchanges commercial sex, so that's trading sex for something of value. That can be money, that can be drugs, that can be a place to stay, that can be food. It can be anything. If a child or a young person exchanges sex for something of value, regardless of whether there was a third party controlling them, that's automatically considered trafficking. What makes our state law even more unique is that up until the age of 21, if law enforcement identifies a victim, they don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. So that means, at the federal level, young people under the age of 18 who are trading sex for something of value are always considered victims of crime. They are never bad kids. They are never the P word, which is often used to describe young people who trade sex. They're always victims of crime. And in Louisiana, if they're under the age of 21, they can be considered victims of crime, regardless of the force, fraud, or coercion or the third party. And that's really important to protect folks who are maybe in that situation, but don't recognize that they're being harmed.
Yeah, I love that. That's so great. I love that under 21 piece. And I should have said that, that definition of human trafficking applies to adults.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you said, a child, it's automatically a crime, right? If that child is approaching you for sex or approaching someone for sex or trading sex, we call that survival sex, right? That is automatically a crime for that other person, not for that child, right? That child needs to be protected and needs to have somebody stand up for them. So yeah, it's never the child's fault for sure. But I love that 21 and under piece for Louisiana. That's great. So this kind of leads us into who is actually being trafficked, and why are some individuals more at risk? Maybe you can go into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a lot of times when we hear politicians and in the media talking about trafficking, what we hear is that it could be your mother, it could be your sister, it could be your family member. And that's true. Anyone can experience this crime. There's no age range. I know with the Greater New Orleans Human Trafficking Task Force, we had served folks from the age of 3 months old all the way to folks in their 80s. There's no gender discrimination. We served male identifying folks, female identifying folks, trans individuals, gender nonconforming people, We served folks who were US citizens and foreign nationals. We served folks of all socioeconomic levels, all races. So this idea is really true. Anyone can be abused through force, fraud, or coercion for sex or labor. However, traffickers are really about the bottom line. They're about making money, because that's the thing that makes trafficking different from other horrific interpersonal crime like domestic violence, sexual assault. And so traffickers are trying to pick the path of least resistance. And so oftentimes they take advantage of folks who are particularly vulnerable or particularly at risk. What that means is we tend to see traffickers take advantage of folks who have vulnerabilities. So youth who aren't fully developed, they don't know necessarily how to tell a good relationship from a bad relationship. They may target undocumented folks because they can use their status as a way to control them. They may take advantage of people with disabilities, racial minorities, or folks who face discrimination like the LGBTQ+ community. So while trafficking can happen to anyone, we tend to see that traffickers pick folks that are at a disadvantage or are facing really serious vulnerabilities in their life. Susan, is that the same for what you see at the national level?
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely what we see everywhere, right? And it's those vulnerabilities that those traffickers prey on. So not only the vulnerabilities that you said, it's also, those vulnerabilities that come from people who don't have a stable family life, right? Who are already being abused, right? They're already set up for those traffickers to accept what that trafficker is going to say, because they already know that somebody who hits them tells them that they love them, or if they're neglected already, right? So maybe their parents are good parents, but they're just not around, right? They're working 2-3 jobs to try to make ends meet, and they're just not around. And the trafficker tends to prey on those types of vulnerabilities. So we do for sure see that most of the people that are trafficked have these vulnerabilities already. But that doesn't exclude, like you said, anybody. At the Junior League National Conference that I was at 2 years ago in Denver, I was on a panel with this lady that I can't remember her name, but she has a soap ministry. But she was from a good home in an affluent neighborhood with 2 parents living at home, and she managed to be trafficked while going to school, right? Her parents had no idea. She had to sneak out at night. These traffickers will also, they get younger and younger too, not just the victims, but the traffickers tend to get younger too as the years are progressing. And so, she was trafficked by somebody in high school. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And so, they just learn to prey on the vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities of someone who's just a teenager, right? They have vulnerabilities. But those things happen, but for sure the majority, they already have these vulnerabilities that you and I already said, yeah. So how do we know then if somebody's actually in danger of and being trafficked, right? Or even in danger of being trafficked, or in danger and being trafficked? What are your thoughts?
This is the question that I think I get the most is, what does it look like when a person's being trafficked? How do I know? And it's kind of the question that I get the most nervous to answer, right? Because unfortunately, there's no way to look at someone and say, oh, that's trafficker. Because if that was true, our jobs would be so much easier. We could just look at someone and say, oh, that's a victim, we need to help them. Oh, that's a trafficker, we need to help them. Unfortunately, we have to look beneath the surface, because so often what folks are experiencing that answer that age-old question, well, why aren't they leaving? Why don't they leave? It's that psychological control, the fraud, and the things that we can't see. So I would be happy to share some red flag indicators and some things that you might notice that indicate abuse. But I always like to caveat that you want to make sure that if you think you identify trafficking, that you leave it to the experts to intervene, and that being in community and being in relationship with each other is the best intervention. not going in Liam Neeson style if you think you see something. But generally, some of the indicators of trafficking that we see when we may notice a client we're serving and then say, I think that there's a risk there for trafficking. You may notice with youth, for example, you may notice signs of abuse, physical harm. You may notice changes in behavior. So maybe they were really doing well in school and all of a sudden they're not doing well, or they're moody, or they're struggling in classes. So some really big mood changes. You may see some changes in, they may have things they didn't have before, clothing, purses, etc. You may notice just general signs of neglect with that young person. Let's see, I don't know why I'm drawing a blank right now. Susan, you want to help me? I'll ping pong.
Sure.
Yes.
There really is no, one indicator, unfortunately, and those are some great signs. And I would say, if you're out and about, and these are not, maybe people that you come into contact with a lot, and so you see a situation that you think might be trafficking, we always like to say, a person never speaks for themselves, right? So the trafficker will control that person, control what they say, who they talk to. They typically won't have control of their documents, with their ID. They won't have their own money. You could sense that somebody's withdrawn. And I know, as moms, we get that gut feeling, right? That I don't think something's right here. And so Leanne was great, right? You got to let the experts deal with it. And so what we always say is you want to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And I know that was a kind of a question later on, but you definitely want to do that if you think trafficking is happening. So, if you see an older guy with a younger girl, and that's not always going to be the case, but in the US, it is typically, the pimps are typically an older male and the victims are typically a younger female. Again, that doesn't always happen. So let's not say that that's the only case, but if you see that and you really feel like something's wrong, if the person is dressed inappropriately for the weather, if it's December in Chicago and you see somebody out and, it's not New Year's Eve and they're being all fancy, right? And they're young and they're with somebody who's older and they don't really look so great, they're dressed inappropriately, you might want to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline number and let them know. There's signs also of beatings, right? So they might seem malnourished or they might have bruises. They might also have tattoos. So traffickers are putting tattoos on their victims. It could be a dollar sign. It could be, daddy's girl. There was just something on today with my teammates. They were talking about a young lady who had a Spanish word on her forearm, even though she didn't speak Spanish. Because her trafficker tattooed something on her arm in Spanish that basically said, property of Jose or something. And so those are some other signs that you might be on the lookout for as well. Anything else come to mind, Leanne?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of labor trafficking situations. Sometimes there can be workplace injuries, malnourishment, folks who work where they live, where they work. So in some health and beauty massage settings, in some agricultural settings, that's normal for guest workers. But it can also be indicative of an exploitative work environment. So sort of catching on to those things that just don't seem right, that seem inappropriate for the situation can be really critical. And I want to say too, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, when you make those referrals, depending on what you tell them they can share, they can go straight to my law enforcement partners at the task force or folks like me to do those investigations immediately, thoughtfully, in a trauma-informed and dignified way, because your instinct may be to go and try to talk to that person. But first of all, victims and survivors very frequently choose not to disclose. You can imagine if someone's like, are you being abused? You're not going to disclose that to a stranger usually, right? And so acknowledging that you may do more harm than good, letting the experts come in, offer them services, build relationships that may be more healing for folks, and it may actually have a better outcome. So that hotline is an amazing way to make sure that those folks are safe.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just shoot that number out. It's 888-3737-888, or you can text Be Free. So either of those resources are available, and a survivor or a victim can call that too, to request help. But you touched on a great point, right? Like, we don't want to ask if for some reason you would be able to come into contact with a victim, right? Let's say you were at a restaurant together, you know, at a truck stop or just a restaurant or hotel together. You think they're being trafficked, right? You go to the bathroom, happen to go to the bathroom at the same time. You never, ever want to ask if they're being trafficked or abused because, you know, no, they're going to say no. But you could ask things like, when's the last time you talked to your family? Hey, you know, my favorite color is red. What's yours? I mean, just something really ridiculous, right? Because they want to feel like a person, because they don't feel like a person. They don't feel like a human being, right? Imagine having to have sex, or really what we say is being raped, multiple times a day. They just feel less than human. And so just asking them how they are. And then you can ask, do you have control of your money? You know, do you need help? If the answer is no, then you just say, okay, right? You never want to get up in their face, because they'll know you're going to put them in danger of being beaten by their trafficker. And so, you know, just little ways you could potentially engage with them, but definitely we just say, do not approach them. You want to call the hotline because they're connected with law enforcement that is trauma informed and can call them immediately. But if you do think there's a potential danger, like right now, then absolutely call 911, call local law enforcement. The National Human Trafficking Hotline would like you to call them as well, just to report it, because they're the only national organization that keeps statistics on these types of incidents. So it's just good to have those statistics. So Leanne, how prevalent is human trafficking in New Orleans?
That's a really good question. We are not quite sure what the prevalence is of human trafficking really anywhere in the world. Prevalence estimates are really hard with a hidden crime like trafficking, because like we said, not everyone identifies as a victim. It's a hidden crime because it happens beneath the surface, and folks experience trafficking in very different ways in very different industries. So it's really hard to quantify. However, trafficking is absolutely happening in this state and in New Orleans. With the Greater New Orleans Human Trafficking Task Force, which has 4 service providers in the Greater New Orleans community, over 3 years, they served over 360 survivors of trafficking. So that's just 4 agencies in the Greater New Orleans area over 3 years. So I think that really tells you that's just scratching the surface, right? That's just a small sample of the community that we're in. And so we know trafficking is happening, and it's also happening throughout the state. It's not just in urban centers, it's in rural centers. There's an annual report put out by the Department of Children and Family Services. And what they found is that trafficking is happening, and cases have been identified in every parish across the state. That's Terrebonne, that's Lafourche, that's, you know, over in Lake Charles, and here in Baton Rouge, in New Orleans, it's everywhere. And so it's hard to imagine the exact number at this point, recognizing that we are just beginning this journey to identifying survivors.
Yeah, and same thing nationwide, right? I mean, there are no actual numbers. They think there's a couple 100,000 being trafficked, but like you said, it's such a hidden crime and way underreported that no idea how many people are being trafficked. But Polaris, right, National Human Trafficking Hotline, just like you said, they find that trafficking, whether it's labor or sex trafficking, is happening in every single state and in every type of community. And so we need to be aware of that. Don't think that your town or city is immune to this, because unfortunately it's not, right? My coworker always says, where you have homeless people, you're going to have trafficking, and who doesn't have homeless days? And where you have adult trafficking, child trafficking is definitely happening as well. So as much as we don't believe that, it is the truth, and it's a hard truth to swallow there. All right, let's talk a little bit about COVID-19, because that's fun. What have you seen for the impact of COVID-19 on trafficking and maybe even those rescued as well?
Yeah, this is a really important question, because I think the world's not sure what's happening right now. We've not faced a global pandemic like this in our lifetime, and certainly not since the anti-trafficking movement really existed, right? So this is a bit of a first for us. However, in Louisiana, we do have experiences with major disasters that impact our community. And so I looked to Hurricane Katrina as sort of a case study to help us consider how disasters impact our community. In the post-Katrina era, there was a documented rampant human trafficking that occurred. We see with like natural disasters, for example, that in the immediate aftermath of that disaster, so when folks are still in that emergency state, fighting for their lives, we see a lot of survival sex. We see folks who are trading sex with folks who are rebuilding. And certainly traffickers, like I said, they're here for the making money, right? And so we see that they move into places where disasters are occurring. And then in that recovery phase of a disaster, we see that there's rampant abuse in labor. One thing that is really disturbing is in the post-Katrina era, we saw major cases involving labor trafficking of guest workers who were here to help us rebuild our state. The biggest labor trafficking case up until that point in the history of the United States actually was through the U.S. Attorney's Office here in New Orleans. It's the Signal International case. So if we look at that disaster and we sort of apply it to this moment here that we're in, we can think about it again in these two phases, this sort of emergency phase and then a recovery phase. Still kind of in an emergency phase right now. What we have seen and what we are continuing to see is that, first of all, the disaster completely destabilized folks. Folks lost jobs. It destabilized some communities. People were disconnected from their support groups, whether it's children from school with safe adults, whether it's adults from their families who are taking care of them, whether it's deaths in certain communities are disproportionately affected by death in COVID. It really destabilized folks. And so what we see again is this instability forces folks to make difficult decisions to stay alive, whether it's, again, survival sex, being taken advantage of. And what we may see is in the recovery phase with so many people unemployed that same sort of rampant labor abuse could occur as we recover. Our service providers have seen a huge uptick in like emergency shelter and folks experiencing homelessness, needing direct services. However, referrals for service providers, so for example, those important adults like teachers, aren't making as many referrals to child abuse agencies. And so we have this really interesting moment where we're expecting, like post-Katrina, we're going to get a huge influx of cases of folks emerging from abuse situations once the dust sort of settles and things are more stable.
Yeah, and I think you're probably finding that nationwide. And one of the things we also say is for those that are already being trafficked, right? Mm-hmm. Now they're in an even worse situation, right? Because they can't get the services that they need. They're not out and about, and so they're not interacting with a lot of people in order to someone potentially recognize that they're being trafficked. And I'm sure, I don't know for sure, but like 90% sure that, the trafficker, they don't care, right? They're in it for the money. And so they're still going to require these men, women, boys, and girls, their quota. And so I think you're right, Leanne. It's going to be post that we're really going to see the ramifications of all these shutdowns, and it's not going to be great, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in parallel movements too, whether it's elder abuse, child abuse, domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, I think all of these crimes are sort of interrelational in terms that there's the person abusing and the person being abused. And so that inability to escape is just even more present now than it was before COVID. And that's really concerning. And so there's an opportunity for us as community members to do everything we can to try to stay connected, whether it's with our parents who are in elder care facilities, or the young people in our lives, our cousins or our nieces and nephews, or the folks that we go to church with. I think that interconnectedness is something that we can control. We just have to do it in different ways that we're physically distant.
Yeah, that's great. So let's touch a little bit on the traffickers themselves. We've talked a lot about trafficking victims. I touched a little bit on traffickers, that they're becoming younger. But we know, like you said about the victims, right, that they know no racial, socioeconomic bounds, gender bounds. And that's the same we find with the traffickers, right? So I know for sure from a national perspective, we've seen a firefighter that was a trafficker, a cheerleader, right? A high school cheerleader was trafficking some of the younger girls on the cheerleading team. Crazy. There was an ambassador in New York from, I don't know if it was a UN ambassador or if she was from India, but she was charged with human trafficking because she brought over a lady who was her maid, took control of her documents, right? Paid her a ridiculously low wage, like $2 an hour, wouldn't let her leave. And she was convicted of human trafficking, right? So that's somebody way up that socioeconomic ladder. There was a teacher trafficking her kids, which is horrendous to me that a teacher would do that. And we know that there are actually parents that traffic their kids, as even more horrific as that sounds, right? It's familial trafficking. But that does happen. And so these traffickers are just really anyone and everyone. But what are your thoughts in the New Orleans area about the traffickers?
That's a really good question. The first place that my mind goes to when I think of the imagery of the trafficker is going back to those movies and shows I mentioned earlier. It's that gang member, it's an ethnically ambiguous, it's male, dark-skinned. There are these very specific connotations that we see over and over again.
I always say, thank you, Starsky and Hutch, for Huggy Bear. Because that's what we think of when we think of a pimp.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really unfortunate is that this is fed by racial dynamics of racism and xenophobia, going all the way back to the early 1900s until now, unfortunately. According to a really incredible Washington Post article that did an examination of trafficking convictions at the federal level, what they saw is that disproportionately young Black men were charged with sex trafficking. And what we know as professionals working in this space is that it is not just young Black men who are trafficking people. It is that, unfortunately, we have this idea of what a trafficker looks like. And so we miss it when somebody's mother or father is abusing. There was a case in Amite, Louisiana. Some of you may know it as the case that had the girl in the cage. I encourage you all to look a little bit beneath the surface on that. It was a young woman who had a disability, who had family members who not only gave her horrible living conditions, but forced her to work and took her disability checks. So it was labor trafficking. And then they attempted to sell her for sex. So there was attempted sex trafficking, right? And that was just, the governor says, that's in my town and I didn't know. So I think it's really important that we take a moment to reflect on our biases and remember that traffickers also take advantage of that. There are many cases that we've seen female traffickers, right? And we assume that women can be traffickers. And that's definitely the case in Louisiana. There's no gender, racial, citizenship, or socioeconomic identity that we can use. It's just simply somebody who is abusing another person.
Yeah. So let's talk about maybe the healing process here. So when a call comes in and law enforcement recovers and does what they're supposed to do, which is get them services, what does that healing process, and what are some of those providers that can help in New Orleans?
Good question. I'm on a kick with these trafficking shows. So another foil, right? If you think of Taken with Liam Neeson, at the end, he rescues this girl. She's so thankful to be rescued. She's so happy to go home. And at the end, she's happy with her family and there's a pony and everything's great. With our survivors that we work with, the healing journey, unfortunately, does not end when the law enforcement gets involved or they exit the trafficking situation. That healing journey is a lifelong journey. And so the initial experience with our service providers, first of all, we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We take care of those emergency care options. We make sure that there's housing. Thankfully, in our community, we have Covenant House New Orleans, who will offer emergency housing and shelter to any trafficking survivor, regardless of age or identity. So we have these incredible providers who are ready right away to get that emergency care 24/7. We have folks who are offering mental health services, ongoing job and educational training. We know that survivors, some have not maybe finished high school or college. They may not have traditional job skills. And so that's really important to them to find a new way to make money that's safe and not abusive. And then we have different mechanisms that we use to support survivors in a holistic way. So we use what's called a multidisciplinary team approach, or an MDT. It's where we have a community of providers, of law enforcement or a prosecutor, service provider, of all different types, shelter provider, and we'll sit at a table and we'll discuss how we can support that client, whether they need mentorship or ongoing care. That process is ongoing, sometimes for years, sometimes for just a couple days, but it's always there. And we have a really incredible network of providers in Greater New Orleans. I know within the task force, Greater New Orleans Human Trafficking Task Force Network, I think there are about 80 something partners that are all involved at that table from all different disciplines. And we're glad to see that that's happening across the state now too.
Great, that's a great segue into how we all can make a difference, how everybody out there listening tonight can make a difference. And when I listen to you, I think of so many ways that I know for sure I'm in trucking, right? So nobody out there, I'm sure, is a trucker. Maybe you are, and great, right? You can take our training. But if you're not, there are so many ways that you as an individual, or you with your company that you work with, work for, own, people that own companies, right? You talked about a lot of these people not having job skills or having an education, right? So how do we as a business, how can we support that, right? I'm thinking we can make it a point to hire survivors.
Love that.
So most companies do background checks, but that does not preclude anybody from hiring somebody whose background check comes back with things that are expected, right? If they've been arrested for prostitution, which should not be an arrestable crime, the traffickers should get arrested. But can you still hire them? Can you have some sort of what do I want to say? Anyway, like a mentorship program with a survivor? Can you provide job skills in your company? And for sure, from we have an anti-trafficking in persons policy at Truckers Against Trafficking that is available on our website for you to look at. And I think every single company should have this. Basically, it says, you know what, if you use company time or resources to purchase commercial sex, there are consequences. And the company gets to decide those consequences and what they are. But, you know, every company should stand to fight human trafficking. And that, I think, is one of the easiest things that everyone out there can do. Any other ideas from a business perspective there, Leanne?
Yeah, you know, you bring up an anti-trafficking policy. I think every business should make sure they have an ethical supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much important work happening right now to ensure that you can buy products that are used with fair trade, ethical labor that follow basic labor standards. I think as consumers, we have so much power. And so every business has an opportunity to write that into their policy. And there are some great leaders in the corporate spaces like Nike, like Costco, who made a lot of mistakes before, but now have really incredible, robust policies that you can learn from. Another thing is there are so many opportunities with either in-kind donations with your time. So going to Covenant House, going to Eden House, and giving a talk on what it's like to work in your industry, offering mentorship, doing a resource drive. You know, I know so many of the nonprofits we work with are supplying folks food, they're supplying youth supplies like diapers. And so I can promise you those diapers are going to trafficking survivors. And then the other thing you can do is get educated. There's so many incredible resources online. Think about ways that you can learn so you can support the people in your life, in your community. I think we can all benefit to learn how to support young people and building healthy relationships. And there's a lot of great resources through either NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, from Polaris online. And there's some fantastic trainings for all of us that we can take as community members to learn.
Great. I think that's a great place to land as our time is coming to an end, but I know we're going to go to some Q&A. So Michelle, are you in charge of that?
Yes, I will ask y'all. Thank y'all so much. This was extremely helpful. So we have a few questions from attendees. So the first one, Leanne, you kind of answered it, but I just want to ask it in case there's anything else to add to it. This was earlier on. One individual asked, when you call the National Trafficking Hotline, how does that inquiry reach the local level, and how long does that take?
That is an excellent question, because I know it can be really scary if you call a hotline and then you have no idea what happens on the back end. And just to set the scene, you likely will not know what happens with a situation once you call. But essentially what the process is you call in the hotline. They will ask you if they are allowed to share that information with law enforcement or not, which, by the way, is a fantastic feature. If somebody's scared to call the hotline because they're worried about law enforcement being called, they will not notify law enforcement unless you ask them. So keep that in your back pocket if you ever have someone who's scared to call. If you do notify that, yes, I want this to go to a local investigation, what they do is they listen, they read whatever that is, and they send it to the appropriate points of contact. I know they send them at least weekly. It really depends on how urgent the case is after they screen it. They send it to local contacts, and then those local contacts will investigate it. Every different agency that receives those referrals will respond in a different amount of time. In the cases where somebody calls needing emergency services for a client, we get those calls that night. We get called to include into that phone call immediately to support that victim. So this is to say that it depends, and you may not know what happens, but it always gets to us, and we try to respond to those as in a timely manner as possible.
I would add to that, you know, if you think you're in danger or somebody's endangered, call 911.
Yes, please.
Yep, let's do that. And then if you're unsure of what's happening, please call. Because it's not like calling 911. If you're unsure of what's happening, they will ask some questions, they will talk you through it and assess the situation, and then maybe assign it to someone to investigate further. But don't be afraid to call.
Right. And I see a question from Margaret in the chat. It says, does the process stop if you don't want to notify law enforcement? No, the process doesn't stop. What they'll do is they will ask clarifying questions about whether service providers can get involved. So there would be many situations where someone would say, I don't want law enforcement involved, but I want emergency housing. I want to get out of this situation. And that's when our incredible local service providers get clued in, and we figure out a safety plan to help that person. So definitely, if you call, regardless of whether it goes to law enforcement or not, it can continue as long as that survivor engages. I know there have been situations where I got a call from the hotline that I was talking to an advocate for a couple weeks as that person would check in and check out and check in and check out. So it's really client dependent, which I love, because every survivor needs something different, and we try really hard to meet survivors where they're at.
Great. Okay, another one we had come in says, it sounds like many or a lot of the trafficking includes a grooming process or is somewhat premeditated. Are there a lot of scenarios where children are kidnapped at public locations, in parentheses it says parks, malls, etc., and are then sold or pimped out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure we can both answer that, Leanne. So I think that the majority of people are groomed. They are trafficked by somebody they know, whether it's somebody they just meet and then that grooming process starts and they're groomed for a year or so, or whatever amount of time, and then they're trafficked. I won't say that kids are never kidnapped, because that does happen. But the reality is that is slim. That is definitely in the minority of what's happening. But so it does happen, but the majority is definitely a grooming process or by someone and trust. Leanne?
Yep, I like to give folks the anecdote. I've been doing this work for in Louisiana for 4 years, and I have only ever been involved in a case involving kidnapping twice. Once was a true stranger kidnapping, and the other was a trafficker kidnapping someone that they had been abusing for a while. And I think it's important to remember that because so many survivors are controlled by coercion, those psychological chains rather than the physical ones, that means that there has to be some level of relationship. And that's why there's so much information out there now about the fact that, so often, I think it's like 9 out of 10 times that child abuse happens at the hands of somebody who's a close family friend or a family member.
Yeah, and I always say, we did that whole stranger danger decades ago, right? Of being abused by or taken by somebody you didn't know. And the reality is, like you said, people are abused by people they know, whether it's family or family friends. And the same is true, I think, with trafficking.
Well, I don't want to leave on a sad note. I mean, I know this is a very heavy topic, and you all provided incredible information and resources, and just continue to build awareness is really what the Abolish Movement really wants to do. So this is the first of a 3-part series, and I'll share my screen real quick just in case you or anyone who attended tonight is interested in learning more on this topic. We do have 2 more upcoming. So our next one will be in December, about how to talk to your children about human trafficking, and then one in January, which it's time to take action. How can we fight human trafficking? So these are free. These are open to the public. If you know anybody interested, we would love to have anyone join us. Please share on your social channels about this. Again, our hope is to really build awareness around this issue, and we need you to do so. And let's see, sorry, I have one more slide. We don't want to leave you again without any resources. Again, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is 24/7. This is it on your screen, this 188 number that Susan mentioned earlier, or you can also text So please, if you are in need or see anybody in need, please, again, as these ladies mentioned, please reach out. And these are some resources available. They were kind of mentioned throughout the discussion tonight, but these also do live on the Junior League website. So again, if anybody would like to, needs resources or has people that need resources, please reach out. And again, just to kind of conclude, I can't thank you ladies enough for tonight. We are beyond grateful to have you join us and discuss this hard but yet very important topic. So thank you for sharing with our community and for all you do to serve those, those victims out there.
Yeah, so happy to be on. I appreciate the awareness that you're bringing, and if anybody needs any specific information from me, they can feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. Well, great. Well, thank you again. And yes, hopefully those on who want to join us next time on December 8th, we would love to have you join us. Thank y'all again. Good night, everybody.
Thank y'all so much.
Good night.
This was wonderful.
Thank you.